Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Debrief podcast. Josh Durso and Jackie Augustine here inside the FingerLakes1.com studio. We're doing a little 2024 Wrapped edition today. We're turning the clock back. We're going to talk about the things that stood out most to us this year, watching, observing news here in the Finger Lakes. What a year. What a year 2024 is currently.
There's lots to talk about.
There is. The first thing I have to mention, though, right off the top before we get started, because this is all a little bit inspired, I guess, by Spotify Wrapped.
Yes.
You have, I told you already, you have the most incredible Wrapped I had ever seen.
It's
ever
an
in my
eclectic mix.
It is so. Kendrick Lamar, Bach, Steely Dan,
Yes.
all were in your top 5 artists for 2024.
And our entire family, all of our kids, we all have George Strait honors this year, which is interesting.
It's really interesting. And I mean,
We listen to a lot of music, and I like all different kinds of music, and I listen to it all the time. So
you don't have to tell it. You don't have to tell it with that lineup. You don't have to tell anybody that I
yeah.
like all kinds of music.
Yes.
You do.
I am one of those people that can quote song or work song lyrics into basically any conversation.
We'll see if you do that at all today.
All right, I'll think on it.
Okay, so let's get things started here. And I guess I want to go first. We're going to kind of go back and forth here because we each have 5.
Yep.
We're going to talk about different pieces of our list here as we go. You'll be able to see, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see everything up on the screen. If you're listening to the show, we'll do a good enough job explaining what's going on that you won't feel lost, or you shouldn't feel lost. But I want to start with dissolution. I started this year having a number of conversations on Inside the FLX here in this very studio around Wolcott's proposed dissolution, which was ultimately defeated by voters. And it was really interesting because one of the things that stands out whenever dissolution comes up is readers and listeners of this show are always pretty well surprised at how little input villages actually have on the dissolution process. There's a lot of like sort of handshake verbal agreements along the way, but nothing that is concrete, because once dissolution actually happens, the town, which the village is being dissolved into, essentially can do whatever they want. They can make whatever decisions they want to make that are best for them and their taxpayers. But it's interesting because now we end this year with another dissolution story. The village of Odessa, for completely different reasons, is likely staring down the proposition of dissolving within the first couple months of 2025. And it's so interesting because we've had a couple stories now. The village mayor down there posted a lengthy column in the Odessa File, which gained a lot of traction, of course. We picked up part of the column and sort of told the story a bit from his perspective, which is just that, he's stepping away. He's been the mayor, I think, for like 16 or 20 years or something ridiculous like that, long time. Public servant in an arena clearly where there aren't a lot of people who want to do the job, but now no one's come forward to run.
Has that happened before ever? Like, I feel like I need some kind of state historian moment to try and figure out like what happens if nobody runs.
So this is what happens.
I mean,
so the mayor's seat, from what I was able to dig up over the last few days, a vacancy on a board of trustees in a village, a village can survive that.
Right.
It's not ideal.
One of a few, yes.
But as long as there ends up being a quorum, you're good to go. However, if it's the mayor's seat,
Right.
it essentially like it creates all these like holes and gaps in what would most
Yeah,
people
that's
would
like
think of as
your-
like your charter.
Yeah, that's
So
like
the
your
thing that
administrative
defines
officer.
you.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, unlike, in cities, all right, like Geneva has city manager form of government, so I don't think it would be exactly the same thing. But yeah, in small villages, like your mayor is your administrator.
Yeah.
So you cannot do any business. No
No.
municipal business could be done.
And the one of the things that stands out to me from watching the reaction, especially on Facebook, to this is just this tidal wave sort of oh well you don't need a village government. This will make government more efficient. It'll make government smaller. It'll make and there's all these ideas that I think just basically are false that are applied to the concept of dissolution. Like I consider myself a small government guy, but less government doesn't mean smaller government. It just means a bigger government that's further away from you making decisions for you. And when people think of like village to town, it's not that big of a deal. But I think in context of a lot of the things we're going to talk about over the next hour, there's no guarantee that a lot of town governments are going to survive in the next 10 to 20 years. So every opportunity, and this is kind of like my message to people in general, is just every opportunity you have to maintain it, you need to take those steps to maintain it. Like you need to maintain as much of your local governance as possible, because when decisions start being made for you, further away from you, it's harder to have input that's effective.
Now, see, I agree with that in principle, but I think, and we'll probably get to this later on when we talk about our predictions for 2025, I think that I'm not as worried about, I would be worried about the magnitude of representation that individuals have. That is cause for concern. But I am one of the people who thinks that consolidating governments will result in efficiency. So I don't, now I understand that it really does depend on what the plan is and who's carrying out certain functions and how that's happening. But responsiveness is something I agree is a concern. But in general, I see some of these dissolutions as a step in the right direction in terms of getting a better handle on how we provide essential services without driving people out of their homes with higher taxes. But we'll talk about that later.
Two things can be true at the same time. And I would actually completely agree with that assessment that it would be, and especially since we're going to talk about schools and a bunch of other things where consolidation is clearly, I think, the better path forward. But one thing that really like stands out to me is like every time we peel away a smaller layer of government or a smaller entity, like say a very small town school district, you're losing identity. And it's not like these entities are being folded into thriving municipalities. Like, the village of Odessa, or I'll use Wolcott as an example, would be rolled into the town of Wolcott, which the town supervisor told me late last year is essentially, to use his words, I'm summarizing a bit, but he essentially called it a poverty town. Like, it's, yes, efficiency is better, but also at the same time, are all of your desired goals going to be achievable because you're doing this?
Right.
No. So, again, you and I have talked about it so many times. It's about good planning. It's about, making sure that people are engaged, actually getting involved. And I think the one really positive takeaway for Odessa right now, as we sit here and record this 5 or 6 days before Christmas, is that there's still time. There's still time for someone to run for mayor, because literally that's all it's going to take.
Well, I mean, one write-in vote.
Like literally
One write-in
just
vote is
run for mayor. You can stop all of this. There's still time to like register officially and all that. Go through the normal process. You don't have to do anything unusual. And clearly there's so little interest, you'll be running unopposed. So
That's wild. Yeah.
do it. and it's one of those rare circumstances I have criticized many times on this show and on Inside the FLX, candidates who run and give me the old, I can't wait to learn more about this job after I'm elected. This is one of the few instances where I'm saying, learn more about the job after you're elected.
Jump in and
Go.
do it, and you'll
Go.
figure it out. Yeah.
So that's that. And, this is, I can't really say anything final about it because we don't know how this is going to turn out. But that's my first one. We're not going in any particular order here today, of course. These are not ranked by any means.
No, mine were not ranked.
So that's my first one. What do you have? What's the first thing that pops to your head?
I think the one that was on my list there was the Ontario County housing stuff. Yep,
Yes.
housing study, which I think is a regional issue, not just Ontario County, but I thought one of the top stories of the year was that Ontario County actually commissioned this housing study. The housing study affirmed with data what many agencies already knew and were telling people, and certainly what residents had been saying over and over that hadn't necessarily been fully heard, which is that there is a housing affordability crisis in this area. It's a function of lack of good units. It is a function of rising rents for the units that do exist, and it's a function of lack of support for general household expenses that make rent feel even more burdensome in somebody's overall, to someone's overall checkbook than it otherwise might if other aspects of the economy were doing well enough that people weren't feeling a pinch. So, yeah, I thought that was a story that certainly we should keep top of mind and hopefully will parlay itself into some action in 2025. I guess not to be Debbie Downer, but I think part of the reason I wanted to kind of keep that at the top of the list is because I don't feel like there has been enough action in response to the study. I think that I always think of government, whatever level, if people ran government more like they ran their households, people say, oh, you should run government like a business. I don't know about that. But I think if people ran government like their households, if I found out that I was having a crisis situation in my household, my energy, attention, human capital, brainstorming would go to that. And I would be open to any ideas of trying to fix that. And I'm not saying I would act hastily, but I would put my energy into saying, okay, here are the short-term steps. Here's the interim stuff, the medium-term factors that maybe I can influence or get some control over. And then long-term, here's my goal, here's my solution. And I'm not hearing that from Ontario County. I'm hearing kind of piecemeal responses, like maybe we can get some money for this, maybe we can get some money for that. But, part of the community survey that accompanied the housing study and helped to inform the final results, the survey tool itself, full disclosure, I filled out one of the surveys, right? But the survey tool itself had a section, I can't remember the wording of the question exactly, but was basically like, what would help? Like, what are your ideas? What do you wish was happening? I don't remember seeing any of that make it into the public discourse. And I think a failing of government sometimes is thinking that only people who are currently at the table have the answers. And I think when it comes to something like the housing issue, I think people who are experiencing housing insecurity have a really good handle on what they need to feel more housing secure. And obviously some of that is going to be long-term stuff like let's build more units or let's rehab vacant units and bring them back onto the market. That kind of stuff, yes, we can see that. But I do think, even if we're thinking about how our housing vouchers administered, what flexibility do we have for seeking funding through some of these family self-sufficiency programs on a county level? These are things that residents, I think, know about and are wondering why the county hasn't activated yet, but seem to be getting a little bit lost in the shuffle. So, yeah, my top story is finally we acknowledge that there is a problem. We've got the powers that be saying, oh, wait, looks like something's going on. And now I'm ready to see the action on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The housing one is fascinating to me, and a couple of things that you were mentioning that kind of like trip different things in my brain is, first of all, it's very hard. So much of this is really just about zoning.
Yes,
And
a lot of it.
like
Yeah.
so much of the debate or discussion around housing and how we fix housing and how it gets better or how we increase supply so it can meet demand and you know removing or fixing some of the pinch points in the market right now, all just come down to zoning and the challenge of navigating that when every municipality gets to decide, rightfully or wrong, whatever your opinion is of that, when you have every municipality in a county that gets to decide how their zoning looks, how their zoning works, and the county board of supervisors having little power to, as a body, to force any kind of unified zoning across the board, makes it it's sort of like herding cats. Like, I agree with what you're talking about with regard to the programs or the things that the county board of supervisors could focus on, voucher programs, enhancing the way the county approaches housing for especially people who fall into, say, the bottom third of the economy. But there are so many different issues with housing that it's one of those scenarios where you're having to convince, frankly, elected officials in every community across upstate New York who largely don't experience the things that are talked about in reports like this one.
Right, right.
And
this was
tough.
a news flash for many sitting supervisors. Let me be clear, not the Geneva City supervisors, but the sitting supervisors from other communities who were like, "What, housing? What? I've got a house. I like my house." And so I think bringing it to light like this was very, very helpful. Later on, I think I'll talk about maybe some potential additional opportunities.
Here's one thing regarding housing, and I'll just sort of say this now because housing was on my list as well. Housing is one of the top 5 issues and stories of 2024, without a doubt. I listen to people who own homes in Monroe County, where I live, talk all the time about how they don't want supply to be increased at all because that's going to mean the valuation of their home is going to go down and the value of their asset is going to decline. So it isn't just electeds who are, guilty of sort of this like, well, I don't know if I want to change anything. It's a lot of people who own homes and a lot of people who vote. So it's tough. It's a challenge. Here's my thing. Here's my sole defense, I guess, of Ontario County.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure what Ontario County could do today or tomorrow that would have an impact that wouldn't take conservatively 3 to 5 years to see a benefit to. I'm just basing this off of the types of programming you're talking about. They're very cumbersome. They're very complex. Getting people who are in poverty into programs, I've talked to enough nonprofit folks to know that 90% of the battle, it seems, is getting people into and through very complex bureaucratic systems so there's that. But also, every community is sort of waiting for the moment when building a home, just a median regular old home, doesn't cost $250,000.
Well, and that I think is, if we're generating ideas here, right? I think the power of the purse is something that Ontario County has that could be mobilized. If Ontario County took seriously that housing pressure is an economic development drain, right? It's a real constraint on economic development in the county. I think the county could say, hey, you know what? We've got stuff like sales tax distribution. We've got some discretion about funds that we send back to the municipalities. We're going to start distributing that to municipalities who allow accessory dwelling units. We're going to send that money back first and in greatest quantity to the municipalities that say, they're going to allow zero lot line developments in certain neighborhoods. I mean, I think that there are ways to incentivize municipalities to act quickly and effectively, but they are non-traditional approaches. And I don't know. I'm sure there'd be pushback, right? Because the areas that aren't taking this problem as seriously or aren't experiencing this problem or claim to not be experiencing this problem would not want to feel like they're losing in some kind of zero-sum assessment. Mm-hmm. But I really think that if Ontario County as an entity said, this is a priority for us, a creative mobilization of their existing assets could get some small wins done very quickly.
Yeah, it's possible.
You need like a innovation, like a race for ideas, right? Like give people the space to come up with a strategy and then commit to trying it, to funding it for a bit and see if it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge that always pops up in my mind is just how ADUs always come up, and rightfully so. But in my mind, there's only a couple communities in Ontario County where ADUs would really work effectively. So Geneva, Canandaigua, maybe Victor, but there is such a demand for more housing that you need to develop in the places where ADUs I don't necessarily know would work as well. You need to see more development in Phelps. You need to see more development in the south end of the county. You need to see more development, frankly, where there's a lot of car dependence, right? And to me, ADUs feel more like an urban solution, which can work for, I'm not saying it wouldn't work for those, for a Canandaigua, a Geneva, whatever the case may be, where you have a well-defined commercial corridor where you can sort of work around the mobility part of it. But there's such a demand that, pick your zip code and there might be 4 or 5 houses for sale at any given time.
Well, I'll use your phrase from before, right? Both can be true. I think that's the case. I think, again, I wouldn't want to see the majority of the energy go into developing housing that is more remote in terms of location to services, transportation, grocery stores, etc. So I do think the ADUs, finding ways to use density to help solve the housing problem and keep people well engaged in a community that can meet a variety of household needs, like a place to get food and, close to a school and a library, etc. I think that both could be the case, right? For people who have the means and mobility, housing units that are further out might be their preference or their choice, but an immediate way of bringing some more units into the market, which then, because ADUs in a lot of cases would be occupied by people who are looking to downsize, right? Seniors, that meets that senior market. Then you are actually opening up housing stock, which if you also have a countywide control or incentive to municipalities to control Airbnbs, then you could actually make sure that those empty units get turned back over for actual residents and not just into commercialized properties for vacation rentals. But again, they're nuanced solutions, and unfortunately, sometimes government systems are not well constructed to address nuance, and certainly not to be nimble quickly. But I think if we put our minds to it, we could solve it.
I agree. And I think the one big takeaway for me, the one big takeaway looking forward in 2025, this is not exclusive to Ontario County. Any county in the entire region, there's tons of options. There's tons of options of creative things, innovative things that can be done if electeds, put their minds to it and decide that it's a priority and that they want to do it. And that's really all it comes down
Probably
to.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus 5.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was my
See what
son.
I see what you did. I see
Told
what you
you I
did
can
there.
work in it.
You would do
Okay.
it. Okay. Thanks, Kendrick. Let's talk about schools because that to me was another one of the biggest stories of the entire year. What's the future of schools? So in the last couple weeks, we've had a couple capital improvement projects get voted down. One in Watkins Glen, one in Bloomfield, and throughout this year, I've had sporadic conversations on Inside the FLX, talking with folks about conversion to electric buses, the state mandates around that, the pathways to graduation, how the track from 9th to 12th grade is really going to be changing in the next handful of years for students, for the better from what most people say. And the simultaneous reality where you see school districts and voters in school districts saying, no, we don't want to invest more in our school district. And it just creates this really challenging scenario because you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Right.
I guess we can get into one of my big predictions that I've been yelling for now 8 or 9 months, is that we're going to see eventually countywide school districts. It's coming. It's just a matter of when. It's not a matter of if. I think a lot of the signals, and we're going to get more of them this upcoming legislative cycle in Albany, I think a lot of the signals point to school districts that are either forced to merge into a countywide district or at the very least merge with their neighbors to be able to meet the expectations that New York State is going to be laying out for them in the next, say, 5 to 10 to 15 years. It's going to be unavoidable. And my hope is that people are paying attention and they're engaging with the process that eventually plays out. Because schools in a lot of communities around here are the last bit of local identity left. School mascots, we've seen the kind of passion and energy around school mascots the last few years. Think of your high school football games, basketball games, lacrosse, baseball, whatever the case may be. Those turn out to be sort of communal events in places where, a lot of times you don't have a downtown, you don't have places where people meet. And if you remove that identity, I start to worry about what identity remains for these communities. I think the outcome, going back to something we talked about earlier, the outcomes are better for students in that merged scenario. It's more efficient, clearly. But I think in the process, the community takes a hit because it isn't necessarily what people have been accustomed to, or even really what's safeguarding the preservation of that history of that community identity at that stage. So it's just one of those things that I understand people don't want to see their school taxes go up, but school is getting more expensive. K through 12 education, despite there being fewer students, I see this all the time. People will say, well, why is it this school district has 40% less than it did, 30 years ago, and the per pupil spending is X, Y, and Z, and the budget's $40 million? Because educating is expensive because you got to pay people enough money so that they can survive and live in the community that is, has 100-year-old infrastructure that isn't being invested in because the community's saying we don't want our taxes to go. Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yep.
You need to accept that continuing to exist is going to cost you money, and you're going to have to be personally invested in that, or you're going to watch it erode away and it just not exist anymore. And in both scenarios, you're probably not going to be totally thrilled. Like, you're probably going to be clenching your fists and saying, I can't afford, but you will have to if you want your community to continue existing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to outline what the trade-offs are, because again, if we think about municipality or school district, as a household, you want certain outcomes, right? You want your kids to have a quality education, to have a good experience. Hopefully you want them to be schooled in a facility that is safe and has what they need and gives them, access to opportunity. But you can't deny in many cases that an economy of scale is what allows that to happen. Like, even, is it most efficient for me to drive my kid to school every day versus carpooling? Like, it would be better if we carpooled, if assuming we can't take the bus. I think people understand at a household level how consolidating or collaborating with others can get a better outcome for less investment of time or resources, but we have trouble translating that up the scale, up the chain to government, to school facilities. But going back to your point, I just want to make note, like, I think you were saying about the Watkins Glen vote about like basic facility upgrades. If we look at the data about how people select where they're going to live, people who are locating to the area, right? What the school looks like and offers is part of that evaluation metric that people are making. So disinvesting in the school facilities not only has an immediate negative impact on the school experience for the existing cohort of students who are attending there, but it's also a negative economic generator, right? What would be a negative an economic drain? Because then you're kind of draining off the investment that might attract additional families and households that would help to sustain the very system that you're trying to keep going. So, it is this delicate balance, because obviously I think what we're seeing is a reaction to perceived wasteful spending, but are people spending enough time really engaging with, whether it's a municipal budget or a school budget, to find out if that talking point about waste is actually justified? Like, can we parse out what needed expenditures are versus what people can, this kind of knee-jerk reaction to things just costing too much? Like, I don't know. Sorry, that's like a couple different points blended in there together, but
it's a great point, because I think if people just saw a straightforward balance sheet explaining exactly what the costs are or were for anything in government, whether it's school, whether it's fire service, whatever the case may be, I think they would either have to acknowledge that it's expensive, and costs there isn't that waste happening, or they may just have a very visceral sort of like, well, we shouldn't have it done reaction to it. Right. And I'm not sure what the latter is. Definitely not good. But that's sort of I think it could help. But it's numbers, and
but I mean, I'll
complicated.
say again, this keeps coming up, and I think this will be in part of my predictions for 2025. I think people talk about the high cost of living in New York State and all these different layers of government and taxes and stuff, and then you ask them, okay, where do you think they're doing it better? And they give you a list of places, usually kind of southern or central states. well, what are they actually doing different? And it is county governments, county school districts, consolidated services, public safety services not being parsed out to every small little municipality to try to carry a full contingent of public safety services themselves. It is about economies of scale, and people feel like they're getting adequate service, good service, but it's being taken care of at a county level. But around here, there is that real tension. And like you said, people can't have their cake and eat it too. If you want the local control, you want it done the way it's always been done, you want your friends and family to have the same path that they've always had, and you're worried that by going bigger to the county, you're going to lose that, well, then you have to pay more for it. Yep. Because it costs more to do small.
Yep.
And if we continue to think small, we are going to price ourselves right out of existence, I'm afraid. But
it's numbers, and it's complicated, and people don't like to absorb numbers. Speaking of numbers, you had assessments on your list.
Yes, that rolls us right into
let's
that
talk.
one.
Let's talk about that.
Well, I just thought, again, the story of the year is the increase in property assessments and then the associated tax levy increase, which then, combining those two together under that municipal math, generates a higher tax bill.
Yep.
And that is not specific just to Geneva. Ontario County had a tax increase. Seneca County, I think every county in the region is seeing rising assessments, rising levy, rising taxes. And I think it's a story that can't be ignored, because it is one of these canary in the coal mine effects where people are talking about it. This trend is not going to reverse unless the choices we're making about how we fund and what we fund in local government, in school government, or school districts, in county government, unless people get really serious about that. And what we've seen are serious increases without a commensurate seriousness of the conversation around that spending. So people cannot have it both ways. They can't say, keep everything exactly as it is and how I like it, but make it cost less. Those two things just don't exist. That world doesn't exist. So I think it's a big story because I think it's a big challenge for the region.
It's always funny to me because assessments, I think I had Matt Horn on at some point in the last year or so talking about just how assessments always attract all of this attention and all of its energy for 2 months, because there's this assumption that assessment goes up, taxes go up, right. But it's a year-round problem. Mm-hmm. It's a year-round discussion. Being engaged in your community is just a requirement if you want to have any input on what your taxes inevitably look like.
Yeah, and that's, I think
you don't get to sit it out 9 months out of the year and then just say, parachute in, in November and say, whoa, wait a second.
Right. And that's the takeaway, really, that, assessments, actually, increasing assessments should be a good news story, mm-hmm. right? It's a sign of economic health of a region if your assessments are going up. You certainly don't want to be living in a place where the assessments are going down. For homeowners, home equity's going up. Great. It should be a symbol of prosperity. The reason people around here have come to associate a high assessment with bad news is because they don't like the spending that then is getting assessed through the tax levy against their assessment, which is generating their tax rate and their tax bill. And I think people, like you're saying, this is a wake-up call that you want to get to a point where you can be happy that your assessment went up, and that means you want better municipal finance.
No one wants their assessment to go up until they're selling their house. That was my takeaway from listening to a lot of feedback from people. We collected some feedback in the spring from people who lived in different communities in Wayne County where assessments had gone up.
Or if you want a home equity loan.
Yeah, like there are very it's like you have this tidal wave of no, I don't want my assessment to go up until the for sale sign
Yep.
gets staked out front, and then it's like, whoa, wait a second, hold on. My house that I bought for $125,000 is assessed for 240.
Right.
And I want every penny of that. So, it's another scenario where you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to pick which side of the fence you're going to be on there with that. So, it is what it is. You had a couple other you're a story behind me right now, so I want to get you caught up. You had 2 environmental stories on your list. Obviously, landfill closure, Ontario County, that's literally within the last 2 weeks?
Yeah.
3 weeks?
Happened.
And then also Peter Mantius's cancer cluster story from, I think it was the spring? Feels like it was the spring. It might have been later than that.
Yeah,
I'm not
but
sure.
it got more play recently when Seneca Meadows tried to respond to it. Yeah.
So take it away. Talk to us about those 2 stories, why you felt like they were a couple of the bigger ones for this year.
Well, so Peter, who has done an incredible public service, and I'm sorry that he's moving on from us to a different area, reported about the Department of Health data about a potential cancer cluster, increased incidences of cancer in areas that are adjacent to or near the Seneca Meadows landfill. And that didn't get as much attention when he first wrote it as I really thought it should have, right? That is cause for concern. And then the data got pulled down and there was all this question about, okay, is there going to be further analysis? Now, full disclosure, Blueprint, my nonprofit, is engaged in some air quality monitoring, so I'm not going to get any further into that piece of it. But the issue came up again when Seneca Meadows commissioned a report to try to say, nothing to see here. Increased rates of cancer have nothing to do with the landfill, which is just, from a scientific perspective, an interesting question to pose. Let's prove a negative. Let's prove that the existence of this has no bearing on this other phenomenon, right? And that I found to be kind of, and obviously that sparked the debate, and I think that got more attention from people. So that's a story I would like to see continue to be on people's mind in a broader context of what are the public health trade-offs. I think our theme is turning out to be trade-offs here. What are the public health trade-offs to certain types of industry, to certain economic development choices, to certain conditions that we live in. So I'm just hoping that stays in people's minds, that every choice we make comes with potential consequences, and we shouldn't shield ourselves from discussion of what those might be. The other environmental story was the decision for the Ontario County Supervisors to end their contract with Casella when it expires in 2028. Still a ways down the line, right? Lots to happen between now and then. But I thought the big news about that was that it was nearly unanimous. There was only one supervisor who didn't vote for that. And that is a real policy shift for Ontario County, because Ontario County, in its selection of a sustainability director, in its oversight of that department's operations, which have not really moved the needle on sustainability in Ontario County in a way that other counties have seen gains. It really did seem like Ontario County was all in on maintaining the landfill. And now that seems to have shifted. That policy seems to have shifted. Now, how they will approach planning for the closure will be interesting. There are several communities, not in New York State, that have made similar decisions and really undertook a community-based, robust planning process to get ready for what comes next. I'm not sure we'll see that from Ontario County. I'm not sure they're there yet in terms of trusting community intelligence and using best practices from other communities. I think they're likely to engage people in the trash industry to tell them how to move away from the trash industry. I don't think they've learned the lesson yet that relying on the same experts are going to give them the same kind of outcomes, same responses. But I think a new way of doing business in Ontario County around waste management practices is coming.
Heading into a local election year.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think it has an impact on next year's local elections in 2025?
I mean,
The closure decision. Or
that is
what
yet
the planning,
to be seen.
I guess what that next step would look like.
That is a concern for sure. A lesson we should learn and heed from Seneca town of Seneca Falls is that votes can change, right? Decisions to close can be rescinded later on. It does matter who's in office. So to that extent, I would expect that for seats that are up for supervisor, a commitment to staying the course now that a course has been selected would be an election issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's to be seen.
Yeah. So my fourth biggest story of the year, the fourth story, I guess, that we're going to talk about, you mentioned it, Peter Mantius hanging it up, shutting down the waterfront. He announced that a couple weeks ago, or I guess like a week and a half ago now. He called me a few days before he made the announcement that he was going to be stepping away from it, obviously moving to another state. He and I had a private conversation about the things that led to that decision, and there was a lot that went into it, and to that end, I wrote a newsletter about it, about a week ago. There are a lot of forces working against an individual who is reporting on heavy environmental issues. So just to sort of name off the top some of the topics that he's reported on. Cargill, Greenwich, both landfills, not just one landfill. Right. Sewage sludge spreading down in Steuben County, HABs, all of these issues that are incredibly complex, incredibly heavy. And the overwhelming response to Peter's announcement was obviously, first and foremost, thank you for what you've done. He did all of this for 7 years without taking a penny from anyone for anything. We offered to pay him in the beginning for the work that he was doing, and he didn't want it. He just wanted to do it. He did it because he wanted to do it. So there was that. But one of the themes that cropped up afterwards was this desire from the casual reader or casual consumer of news in the region to find someone else to do it. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the math behind why it just isn't going to happen. And I think the people who have relied on his objective, factual reporting need to figure out what the next step is to replicate that, because this is the math that I'm using to explain why it's very difficult or impossible to achieve. Imagine a 20-something like Peter doing this heavy, intense work. That person is going to need to be paid, say, roughly $60,000 a year to do the and this is just taking industry averages, cost of living standards, very basic stuff, rudimentary, $60,000 a year is around the threshold, given the pressures of that job, the complexity of that job, and the need of it being someone who isn't just fresh out of college with no experience covering heavy stuff. Mind you, Peter, I think, was nominated for 3 Pulitzers. No slouch of a reporter, a damn good reporter. The business side of a $60,000 salary essentially means you need an operating income of $78,000 a year. So you not only need to be an incredible investigative reporter, you need to have a pretty keen business acumen to be able to execute effectively an $80,000 business. What does that translate to? Well, it translates to 1,300 people giving you $5 a month for a year, and then also about $7,000 in $1,000 per month ads. And you get to that, you get to a spot where after taxes, after all of the things that come into running a business of any kind, not just a media business, you get to like that $78,000 to $80,000 number that's required to sustain that. And if you're going to outsource the business side of it, essentially just double all the numbers I just said. And I say that because, I mentioned in my column that I wrote, really just thanking Peter for what he did for the region. I talked about what I thought was his most impactful story of the year, just based on page views on Finger Lakes One. His story about Habs in August racked up about 56,000 page views, which is impressive for a local story. On his website, it attracted about 450 page views. And when you start to think about the numbers that are like the math numbers that I just described, $1,300, $5 a month subscribers, all of a sudden, the math of recreating what he created is just next to impossible. And I know people think like, well, that story on Finger Lakes One had to have generated a ton of revenue. 56,000 is a lot. It generated like $230 in ad rev, that particular story, because Google controls how ads work, programmatic ads. Getting a bit into the weeds on the media landscape side of things. But I say all of this not to like be a Debbie Downer or rain on anyone's parade who thinks like recreating Peter is plausible. I'm more saying it to just remind everyone, if you really believe local journalism is that important, not just event spotlights like what most news organizations do now, which is essentially just, taking stuff that community organizations and groups and governments post to their website or post to Facebook or Instagram and turning that into, an article where it's just essentially free promotion, but actual like investigative journalism, like what Peter did. It's incredibly rare to find anywhere, especially with his experience, but it is impossible to replicate. Like, it just is impossible to replicate unless you have someone, essentially like kind of a trust situation where there's a big donation to a nonprofit newsroom. That's been a method that has worked for some communities over the years. But what often happens with those is they have a life cycle of like 2 or 3 years, because that money runs out and then it has to be supported by grit and the people who are consuming it, if enough people are consuming it. And for a lot of the reasons that we've already talked about, finding an appetite for that kind of work, as important as it is it's a tall hill.
Yeah,
it's a tall hill.
I mean, the ending of the Waterfront blog is a real loss for the community. And I mean, everyone knows, everyone who knows me, right, that I have this like lottery list, right? Like if I ever won the lottery, which will not happen because I don't play the lottery, but maybe someday someone will send me a lottery ticket and it'll be a winning ticket, or I'll find one on the street or something. But no, because then I would give it back because I would feel bad about that. But anyway, if I legitimately came across a winning lottery ticket for a significant amount of money, one of the things on my list is funding an investigative journalist position, because our region needs that. Like the Fourth Estate, right? I mean, the government was created such that a free press, a free and independent press, would be a check on all the other stuff that's going on. Not only, to keep people accountable, but also because it's necessary for an engaged citizenry. Mm-hmm. And what frustrates me so much is when I hear people say, oh, I'm frustrated with, anything we've talked about today, the school budget, the assessments, the city taxes, whatever. And then you ask them, well, did you go to this meeting or did you read this report? Did you see the budget document? No, how would I find out about that? It's like, okay, did you read the paper? Have you checked Finger Lakes One? Are you plugged in at all to the local news and information of the area? People are like, oh, no, I've got a subscription, to, some larger paper, or, they just get their news on social media or they watch it on TV. And they can tell you every kind of national, crazy, sensationalized story there is, but nothing about what's going on in their own backyard. And it's like, people, listen, where can you have the most impact? Right around the corner, right down the street. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't you read, subscribe to, invest in local news and reporting? Like, I don't understand it. I don't. Sorry, it was a rant.
I always go, and I obviously I'm coming from inside the industry, but like I always go back to, people are already stretched thin financially, and cost of living isn't getting cheaper, and there's essentially everything is just costing more money every day, and it's just hard to get people to care about that when they feel like their basic needs are just barely being met. It's Maslow's hierarchy. That's sort of the, I think we one of the systemic things that I've been trying to convince more people of is that humanity in general right now, especially in the United States, has a really big chunk of the population that, whether it's true or not, believes their most basic needs are not being met. Mm-hmm. And that is not a citizenry that can engage in more complex things.
Right.
Like the fact that most municipalities across the Finger Lakes do not update their websites the way they are supposed to, with minutes and agendas as laid out by the great state of New York. And, the most basic things can go
Well, let me bring it back to this running government like a household kind of thing. Like, people understand, no offense to the dads out there, but I got the mom's perspective here, that if your kids are struggling with a basic need, it's very difficult to get them to focus on and work on the larger priorities of their lives. And so moms know, parents know, caretakers know that you have to take care of those kind of basic needs first, and then you can have the more kind of robust discussions. And if people don't understand the point that you've just made, which is that the more people who feel housing insecure, food insecure, economically insecure in general, the more susceptible people are to bad ideas, hasty thinking, knee-jerk reactions, animosity and fear, and that is infecting our governance. And it's in the long run, it makes things worse. Like, if we can't focus on and prioritize fundamental strategies to improve our communities, it's a tautology, right? By definition, our communities will not get better. Yep. And it's hard to get people to focus on that when basic needs are not being met in some cases.
Yeah. My last big story of 2024 is actually probably one of the more underappreciated pieces of reporting that Peter did this year. He had a couple stories on Cargill's salt mine under Cayuga Lake, but just as the legislative session was ending, when everyone was freaking out about the Hochul killing congestion pricing, a bill that would have required a significantly larger bond for Cargill's Cayuga salt mine died, essentially. So think of a bond as like an insurance policy for if something absolutely terrible happens, which the data tends to point to eventual failure of all salt mines. It's just sort of how they work, I guess. It is essentially insured for around $3.5 million total. Think of this bond as that insurance policy. The legislation that made it through the assembly but was killed in the Senate and probably wouldn't have gotten the governor's signature, because Cargill's one of, I believe, the largest company, or maybe the second largest company in the United States, would have required a $10 billion bond. Now, why? Ask yourself, well, why? What Peter's story did a really great job of outlining were a couple examples of what happens when salt mines fail.
Yep.
There, just Google salt mine failure. You will be wowed. You won't just see Peter's story. You will see a lot of, frankly, disturbing things. Imagine this scenario where the salt mine under Cayuga Lake fails, and there are a number of physical things that can occur. Coastlines can change. The body of water obviously becomes salted. There are a lot of, and just think about the Finger Lakes are, I think, near $60 billion tourism economy, and all of the municipalities around Cayuga Lake that rely on Cayuga Lake for drinking water. And think about how right now the only insurance policy against a natural disaster, short of a government bailout, which I'm sure there would be a government bailout in that scenario, is $2.5 or $3 million. It wouldn't even touch a single property, because you're also talking about properties immediately around the lake, or any lake, that are higher than, there are multiple single 1 to 2 acre properties around Cayuga Lake that are worth more than what their policy is to cover this. So I say all of that not to act like there's going to be like an imminent failure of the salt mine or anything like that. But Cargill has been having some issues. They just laid off a little over 8,000 workers in the last couple months. Oversight tends to get a little worse when you start to thin out your worker load. And I just say all that to point out that, this is one of many stories that people really need to pay attention to. And it's easy to overlook it because it is literally underground.
Right.
It is literally under the earth. So it's not front of mind. But that's my fifth biggest story, I guess, of this year. And also maybe the biggest one that people need to pay attention to heading into next year, because the state has been very lax in how they have governed. The DEC has been very lax in how they've governed and regulated Cargill salt mine under Cayuga Lake. So that's also a big reason for it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that ties into one of my predictions for 2025, which I tried to separate out into predictions that I hope come true and predictions I think are going to happen that I hope don't come true. But the one that I hope comes true, right, is that I think legislators in the Finger Lakes region, municipal, countywide, state assembly and Senate, governor, et cetera, need to understand that the industries that are currently operating in the Finger Lakes or might want to locate in the Finger Lakes that have negative environmental consequences or potential for massive negative environmental consequences need to be monitored and regulated in ways that are protective of our long-term interest. And when I say our long-term interest, I'm not just talking about our environmental interest, which is important, but I think people, for whatever political dialogue is going on nationally now, people tend to take a stand against environmental interests in some way. I don't get it, but whatever. But at some point, people need to understand how the environmental interests and the economic interests are so tied, interwoven, wed together, that taking our eye off the environmental ball is taking our eye off the economic ball. And if they can't figure that out, then we need different elected officials. Like, we need people who can understand that and who aren't asleep at the wheel with us protecting our economic assets. And our fresh water is an economic asset, not just because it attracts tourism, but because if we become communities with hypersalinated water, because there are salt mines under Seneca Lake as well, if we become such that the water that supplies our communities can't be relied on, let's go back to property values. Let's go back to people choosing to relocate here. Like, it's, everything about our existence is tied to the quality of the environment, the water, the land, the groundwater, the air quality. Like, these things are important.
Yeah. And, I don't have any predictions that I think won't come true. I think that's how you phrased it.
That I don't want to come true.
You don't want to
Things
come true.
Predictions of what's going to happen that I wish wouldn't. We haven't gotten to those yet. But.
I have 3 predictions that I hope do come true, I guess. I don't have any that fall into the other category, but I'll just rattle them off quickly here. I hope Micron in Syracuse has the impact in the short term that it's promised. I think whether it's photonics, whether it's all I think people in Western New York and Central New York, the Finger Lakes, the Southern Tier, have been made a lot of promises over the years about grand visions for economic development and prosperity.
Fast ferries, anyone remember that?
Fast ferry is another one, yeah. We need one to actually happen, right? Like, we need one to come true. Progress in housing across all counties. We talked a lot about Ontario County. Seneca County has a housing commissioned a housing study as well. It's robust. It's healthy. I hope every county takes housing seriously next year, period. And I'm not saying that I'm demanding policy changes or action. Just try to get some momentum going and just try to make some progress. That's all. And then the last one is the easiest one based on everything we've talked about today is just I hope more people get engaged and more people get involved in local government, in their community. We're coming into a local election year. If you're listening to this right now and you've listened this far into this podcast, I'm going to say that there's a fair chance that you should consider running for something in your town, village, city, whatever the case may be, because you clearly care more than 99.5% of the population. So go get involved. Go get engaged. Go run for something. Show up to meetings, whatever the case may be. It's important and frankly paramount as we go forward, because I think a lot of communities are going to be facing this like looming boogeyman of consolidation if we don't see more engagement soon.
No, I agree. Actually, we have very similar, because my predictions that I hope do come true is the first one I just said, like understanding how all this economic stuff is, environmental stuff is braided together. And my other one was that housing, that all these jurisdictions get a little more innovative, that they're actually able to make use of some of the state money that's coming down the line, that they can focus on density as being part of the solution. But the predictions, the things I think are going to happen that I hope actually don't, I guess I will end as being the Debbie Downer then, because my first one was that I think there's going to be low voter turnout in the upcoming local elections. Oh, yeah. And I hate to say that, but I think that this problem that we're having as a country right now, of being distracted by shiny objects. Oh, that was my last story of the year that we didn't get to, which is that people are not eating the pets. That was going to tie into my prediction, right? The fact that people could get so tied into a story, a fake story about Haitian immigrants eating pets in a local community, and the way that it fell on that municipality in Ohio to have to do all this work to protect people from the fallout of that, to correct the record about that. I think that's part of the thing I'm worried about, that the national climate, the national nastiness is causing us to not be able to do the very important work at the local level of everybody getting good information and making good decisions together, right? Regardless of what party you do or don't belong to, or follow or don't follow, that our communities need us to govern them. And that needs to happen. So my worry is that there will be low voter turnout because people will be affected by or infected by this attitude that government is somehow broken or something, and then they won't participate. So I hope that doesn't come true. And then my last one that I hope doesn't come true is that local governments will continue to ignore economic reality and will double down on what I consider to be territorialism and just protect their current way of doing things to the exclusion of better, more efficient, more sustainable practices, which I think tend toward regionalism. Not that I'm trying to make communities lose their identity or any of the potential concerns that you raised earlier, but the way things are being done in the major cost drivers, whether it's public safety, public works, recreation, whatever, we could be more effective if we were pooling resources and coming up with regional strategies to meet needs than just everybody doing it the way they want to do it in an inefficient, duplicative way.
Yes. That's all I can say to that is just yes, I agree. Because, and the funny thing, we're going to wrap on this, of course, but like, you can preserve your local identity, your community identity, and achieve all of those things. We can have consolidation of government and preserve local identity. The latter just isn't a passive exercise. It has to be an assertive one. The part where you're preserving local history, local community, your community identity, it has to be a thing that people actually choose to do. And unfortunately, the way I see it is there just isn't a ton of energy left over with all of the other shiny objects that you described that pop up and that distract people. There's not a ton of energy to tackle that part of it. So right. The other part, I hope, I do. I'm like you. I actually hope that the efficiencies and the sort of like working together, pooling together, I hope that does happen. It's just a challenge.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for 2024. We'll be back next year. If you have any questions, if you'd like us to talk about a specific topic or have a question that you want to throw at us, the email is debrief@fingerlakes1.com. Of course, we're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the places. Have a great holiday, and we will see you next year.